Welcome back to the Photaudiography podcast. I'm your host Luke, and today I'll be talking all about metering and metering modes. First, let me give you a little background on what metering is. Metering is used to measure the brightness of the subject of your image. The camera adjusts its exposure settings based on the metering. While cameras nowadays have built-in meters, some old cameras did not have built-in meters, and you had to carry around a separate light meter to point at your subject to determine what exposure settings you should set on your camera. If you are using manual mode on your camera, the light meter will appear to assist you to get a proper exposure for your image. So it's important to set the correct metering mode for the situation you are photographing to have your light meter give you the most accurate reading for you to set your exposure settings correctly. However, there are limitations to light meters and camera metering. Normally, a camera's meter, by default, looks at the light in the entire frame of the photo and tries to accommodate the bright and dark portions and create a proper exposure for your photo. There are different types of special metering that can be used to accommodate special lighting conditions. Let me back up for a second and explain how your camera views a scene and determines what exposure settings are best for the scene. Your camera automatically wants to, quote, zero out the meter or properly expose the scene. This would look on the histogram like a bell-curved histogram with limited clipping of highlights and shadows. If you listen to the episode about histograms and how to analyze them, you know what the bell-curved histogram is, and that's a properly exposed image. However, not all images look the way you want them to if the histogram is a bell curve. This is where the mathematics behind your camera and your eyes need to work together to make decisions, and your creative process needs to set in. Use the light meter as a guide. It cannot dictate how you should expose your image, but rather give you a starting point. As I go over the 3 metering modes, you will see how each one is important to make a proper decision to set your exposure properly, and this depends on how accurate your light meter is at suggesting the proper exposure for the scene. I would like to talk about the 3 most common metering modes on digital cameras today, which are matrix or evaluative metering, center-weighted metering, and spot metering. First, I will start with matrix or evaluative metering. This type of metering is usually the default metering mode on cameras. The way matrix metering works is that the frame is divided into zones, and each zone is evaluated for proper exposure. Then it's all combined and sort of averaged out to create what would be the proper exposure for the scene. Matrix metering also looks at where the focus point is and marks the zones near the focus point and gives priority to those zones when deciding upon an appropriate exposure for the scene. Center-weighted metering is another form of metering that you can use. This type of metering evaluates the light in the middle of the frame to provide proper exposure and ignores where the focus point is selected and any light or dark areas outside the center of the frame. You would want to use this mode when your subject is going to be in the center of the frame and you want the subject properly exposed in the center of the frame. The last type of metering mode I would like to talk about is spot metering. Spot metering evaluates the light around your focus point to provide proper exposure for that specific point. This metering mode is best used if the background of your subject is either very light or very dark. Backlit situations are a great example of where spot metering comes in handy for properly exposing these types of scenes. To wrap up, matrix or evaluative metering is best for evenly lit scenes or when using flash. Center-weighted metering is best for portraits, macro, and when your subject of your photo is in the center of the frame. Lastly, spot metering is best used for backlit images, silhouettes, high contrast situations, or when your subject does not fill a large portion of the frame, but you want the subject properly exposed. The whole idea behind this podcast was for me to explain things and have you try them out for yourselves and see what results you get. So I'd like to challenge you, try the different metering modes on your camera in different situations, or try different metering modes in the same situation and see what results you get, and play around with that and see how the different metering modes work for yourself hands-on. Alright, well I think that's enough bad advice I have for now, so I'll see you later, Shutterbugs.